Today we got another Globus event, and this time we are going to dive into automation with GCS. Now, for this presentation, I had considered whether slides would be better or to just view the deploy repo together. But at the end, the slide seemed less hand wavy and probably easier to follow. So, but I had to take some liberties with the URLs and examples to make them fit. So I hope they won't cause any confusion. So I realize that not everyone may be familiar with the Globus deploy repo. So we'll start with the URL, and that's it right there. You won't need it for today's talk, but I'll be referring to it most likely during the presentation and later on. And there's tools in there that you might want to see if you're just getting started with automation with GCS. So, feel free to browse that repo during the presentation if you like, or just follow along with the slides. You can easily locate the deploy repo on GitHub by just searching Globus deploy. So we'll cover 3 topics for automation, which takes us a little beyond just covering the deploy repo, but I think it gives us a complete overview of available tools. We have an Ansible role in the deploy repo that can be used to automate installation of GCS. We have Docker files for GCS also located in the deploy repo that can be used for spinning up GCS nodes. And lastly, we'll talk about how to automate GCS management using the GCS CLI with client credentials. Okay. So with Ansible, you can find the GCS Ansible role in the deploy repo using the pathing here at the top of the slide. And just to keep the terminology straight, not to cause any confusion, using the term role here is an Ansible term, not to be confused with GCS endpoint roles or GCS collection roles. This Ansible role will install GCS on local remote nodes as configured. We do plan for it to do some more functionality than just GCS installation, but we'll talk about that in a couple of slides. And there's nothing particularly binding about Ansible with GCS. We could just likely support Puppet or Chef, but Ansible was chosen at the time because of its ease of deployment. But feel free to contribute support for other DevOps tools. The repo is wide open for PRs. So here we got an example of a local endpoint node installation using the GCS Ansible role. And if you've ever done GCS installation, you can see that it's quite simplified over what you see in what you usually do manually. The example command here may be a bit difficult to read, but it's essentially a GCS installation on any supported Linux distro in just 4 commands. So it boils down the GCS installation doc into simple steps. And though it's certainly not a replacement for the GCS installation doc, since the doc has so much additional information that's useful, but the repo comes pre-configured for local node installation. So you could just execute it on each node, as I did an example here, to do GCS installation. Remember that this is just package installation. You'll still need to use GCS CLI afterwards to configure the endpoint. All right. Here we have an example of a remote node installed using the Ansible role. At this point, this is really just standard Ansible stuff. If you've ever used it before, you modify the inventory file to include the remote hosts. You set up passwordless SSH access to each target node, and then you execute the playbook. So standard stuff for Ansible, and the framework is there on the repo if you're interested in using that. So we do want to add additional functionality to Ansible support. I alluded to this on a few slides back. I think this is going to be a really cool feature and really useful. But I do want to warn you that there is no timeline for this release. I just want to give you a little peek at the direction we're going with it. What we want to do is to provide a GCS Ansible module, so a role, that could take the endpoint's configuration in YAML or JSON and configure the endpoint accordingly and automatically. You can see it in the black box there as a YAML example of how it might look. It's been abbreviated, shortened a bit to fit the slide, but I think you get the idea. You can imagine that the example could be extended with role definitions and collection definitions, which all get automatically created on first run. So that's kind of the direction we're going. I think that's the next big step for GCS Ansible. But again, this is there's no timeline. This is future development. Moving on to Docker, which is also located in the Globus deploy repo alongside Ansible. We provide Docker files for each of our supported GCS distros, which are mainly used for testing GCS release installations, but you can feel free to modify whichever distro Docker file you're comfortable with to suit your needs. And then every few releases, I push updated GCS Docker images onto Docker Hub. You can find them at the location at the bottom of this slide on Docker Hub, JSON alt, and Globus Connect Server. Or you can build the images yourself. It's all explained in the repo, but it's quite simple to do with the tooling that's provided there. All right. So in order to deploy GCS to Docker, you need to make sure that endpoint definition already exists. So, and of course, that requires that you run Globus Connect Server endpoint setup before deploying the image. So Docker doesn't replace any of that. This is strictly the deployment and setting up additional endpoint nodes. So you would save the deployment key and client ID and secret generated by endpoint setup and pass them on to the Docker run GCS script we provide in the repo there. And you see that in the second black box example in order to launch the container. And that script handles serializing and passing that info into the container as it starts. So that's a really brief overview of the Docker capability, but we could talk more about it after the presentation. So there's limitations, and these are all listed in the repo. But when you use Docker with GCS, there's a limited number of the ports you forward. Well, when you set up GCS as used to, you usually have 1,000 ports that GCS will configure that'll be allowed. The port range that GridFTP will use. Fortunately, Docker hits a limit far below that. And so the only workaround at this time is either to reduce the number of proxy ports by Docker or to run it in Docker host networking mode, which gives it full access to the networking stack in the system, right? Also, the container has to be run on port 443. Now, with Docker and other services, you might think the container could map to another port, say 4433 external to 443 internal, but it's not quite possible yet. The container requires a unique IP address that can be reached by transfer and by your users when they use the Globus web app. We don't currently support within Docker container custom domains, custom certificates, or Globus OIDC. And there's a little hiccup. Whenever a GCS container stops, it tries to run gnome cleanup, and Docker stop timeout is not quite long enough and interrupts the process when it's trying to deregister the node from the endpoint. And so this is something you got to watch out for if you're going the Docker route. But I want to stress these things are all possible, workable, fixable. They're just not implemented yet. So again, contributions are welcome. If you're going to extend the Docker image, if you want to make use of Docker in your environment with GCS, there's a couple things to know. I think they're kind of obvious once you dive into it, but forward looking, first, all your users' accounts need to resolve within the container. That could be an NC password, LDAP, NIS. GCS needs to be able to authenticate local users. If you're using POSIX file systems, it has to be able to map usernames to UUIDs and such. And so it needs that information. And then, of course, secondly, because Docker container sandbox the process, you need to make sure your POSIX file systems are mounted, starting from the collection-based path into the container, so GridFTP can find them. Okay. All right. So finally, moving on from Docker and onto automated endpoint management. Again, I realize we're moving quickly, but we'll discuss it afterwards. I'm sure that everyone here is familiar with the GCS CLI that is used for endpoint configuration, but I'm not so sure how well it's known that you can automate the use of the CLI using client credentials. And by doing so, you can avoid authentication timeouts a human identity would see, and it makes the GCS CLI fully scriptable, right? So we actually have a complete document on the process on our doc site in the GCS section under automated deployment. You can see it there at the bottom of the slide, kind of broken up to fit on the slide nicely. And it will go into more detail in that document that what I'm going to get into right here. But it's real simple. The first thing you need to do is to get client credentials. You go from the web app, you go to settings and developers. That's that URL at the top. And there will be an option there that reads register a service account or application credential for automation. And from there, you generate a client ID and secret, which you then feed to the GCS CLI in order to authenticate as a client instead of as a human user. Right. And from that point, once we will, in the next slides, we'll talk about how to configure your endpoint to allow it to administer the endpoint. But from that point, you'll be able to script it using those credentials. And then you can run it in cron jobs, or you can have long running operations that do not time out with authentication. One little public service announcement though, as we've seen this before, don't try to reuse the endpoint's client ID and secret for this. You want to generate separate client credentials, because if you try to reuse the endpoint ID and secret, it could end up causing bizarre issues. So once you have the client credentials, you use these three variables, set in the environment to pass the information to GCS CLI. Right? The GCS CLI client ID, that first one there, is set obviously to the client UUID of the client you generated. Then you got the GCS CLI client secret, which is of course the client secret you generated. And the last one special, it's used to tell the GCS CLI which endpoint you want to run the command against. So you would find the endpoint ID of an endpoint you want to, say, for example, run collection list, set that endpoint ID to the GCS CLI endpoint ID variable, and then run Globus Connect Server collection list. And it will log into the endpoint. I'm sorry, it will authenticate to the endpoint as a client and return the collection listing. There's no need to log in or log out when using the GCS CLI with client credentials. So it's fully automatable and can be used to configure the endpoint when it has the proper GCS role. So here we have an example. It's a little hard on the eyes. Stick with me. In the black box of running Globus Connect Server endpoint setup, and it's using the client credentials. After this command, after this endpoint setup completes, and you later get a node deployed, those client credentials can be used to fully configure the endpoint, since the client is the owner of the endpoint. You can see that the client ID and secret environment variables are set so that the operation runs as the client in the first two lines of the example. Right. I'm sorry, I had to abbreviate the values for the ID and secret to make it fit the slide, so hopefully that makes sense. In this example, I'm setting the endpoint owner to the client that we generated, which you can see the -- owner option in the middle of the example. And the client ID, when you want to use it as an owner or within a role, the client identity is the client ID, the UUID, plus the suffix at clients.auth.globus.org. And you can see that after the -- owner option. This example, though, was for new endpoints, but you can do the same thing with existing endpoints by changing the owner to client credentials. Or, bonus point, if you have a subscription and the endpoint is managed, you can do the same thing with a role, which we will see next. So in this example, instead of setting the endpoint as owned by the client, we can just give the client the endpoint administrator role and achieve the same outcome. which is to allow scriptable endpoint configuration without authentication tie-downs. All right. And for reference, those were basically the 3 topics we covered: how to use Ansible to do installations using that's in the deploy repo, using Docker to do deployment, which also covers installation, I guess. How to use the GCS CLI with client credentials, and again, how to do endpoint management using client credentials. And that is it.
Thanks, Jason.